Hi, Professor. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. My name is Emma Combs, and I'll be sharing how my Christian worldview has shaped my values, my identity, and my calling to serve others. And my presentation is called A Reflection on Christian Theism, Identity, and Serving Others, because I believe those three ideas are deeply connected. And with, with that, I would like to begin. I chose to describe my worldview as Christian theism because it's how I understand truth, purpose, and my identity. I know that James Sire describes a worldview as a fundamental orientation of the heart. And I connected with that because my worldview isn't just something I believe, it shapes how I see myself, other people, and the world around me. For me, Christianity isn't just something I believe on Sundays. It's the lens which I make decisions and build relationships and I live my life. So as I prepared this presentation, I actually realized one question that shaped a lot of my life, and that was what gives a person worth. For a long time, I believe my value came from achievement and other people's approval. But today, I do believe every person has inherent worth because we're all created in the image of God. And that's why I chose Jeremiah verse 21:11 for this slide, because looking back, I can see that God was leading me even when I couldn't see his plan. So for I know the plans I have for you. Um, and the pictures on this slide represent one of the biggest ways I try to live out my worldview. Whether I'm volunteering, serving through my church, teaching on mission trips, whatever it is, my faith shapes the way that I do serve others. And as I continue, I'll explain how those beliefs shape the way I make decisions, the way I see people, even just approaching my future as a teacher. Before I explain my worldview, I do want to share a little bit about how I got here. These pictures represent some of the experiences that shaped who I am today. So, growing up, I often felt different from other kids. I did spend much of my childhood with my grandma and other older adults and seniors, and I didn't always feel like I fit in. And the picture with the purple hair, for example, was a season when I was just searching for my identity and looking for worth in all the wrong places and other people's approval instead of from God. But then graduating from college was something I never even imagined would be possible. And after graduation, I pursued medicine because I thought that success, wearing a white coat would finally prove I was enough. But eventually I realized I was just trying to earn something God already freely given me. And one of the hardest seasons of my life led me back to God and to a genuine relationship with Christ. Being baptized by my younger brother actually became a symbol of that new identity. And today, I do have the privilege of teaching students, and I believe God has used every part of my story to prepare me for that calling. Looking back, I realized my story was not about just, success and chasing that. It's about discovering that my worth has always come from God. So, the first worldview question that has, I'd say, the biggest impact on my life is, what is a human being? I think this question matters because the way we answer it shapes the way we see ourselves and other people. For a long time, I believed a person's worth came from approval, achievement, appearance. But today, because of my Christian worldview, I do believe that every person has inherent dignity and worth because we're all created in the image of God. And Genesis verse 1:27 says, so God created mankind in his own image. And that verse, reminds me that value comes from who created us and not what we've accomplished or what others think of us. And that belief has truly changed the way I see people. I don't want to define someone by a disability or a mistake or a difficult season they're in life. I want to see the person first. And that really is one of the reasons why I'm drawn to special education. I want every student to know they're capable and loved and valued because their worth is not determined by their abilities. Answering this worldview question changed the way I saw myself, and that changed the way I see everybody else. The second worldview question that has been especially meaningful to me is, how do we know right from wrong? So, for much of my life, my understanding of right and wrong was shaped by culture, my emotions, other people's opinions. And as I reflected on my beliefs, I realized many of those ideas reflected what James Sire describes as naturalism, where morality is basically determined by people rather than God. And today, because my worldview is rooted in Christian theism, I believe right and wrong come from God's unchanging character, not from society or personal opinion. In Micah verse 6:8 says, it says, right here that he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So I love this verse because it reminds me that following God is not just about obeying rules. It's about becoming more like Him and living by justice, mercy, humility. And that belief has changed the way I make decisions. Instead of asking what feels right or what does culture say, I try to ask, what reflects God's character. What would Jesus do? Um, and then after comparing my beliefs with James Sire's description of Christian theism, I realized that Christian theism is isn't just one influence on my life. So it's truly the worldview that best describes how I understand God, people, truth, purpose. And this slide specifically highlights the areas where my beliefs closely align with Christian theism. I do believe we are created by God, and every person has inherent dignity because they bear in His image. And salvation comes through Jesus Christ and Christ alone. And right and wrong are grounded in God's unchanging character. So those beliefs have become the foundation for how I see myself and how I relate to other people. What makes Christian theism especially meaningful to me is its understanding of grace. So, Ephesians 2, it reminds us that we are saved by grace through faith and not by works, our own works. So, that truth completely changed the way I understood my identity. So, for years, I believed I had to earn my worth through achievement and other people's approval. But Christianity taught me that my worth is not something I have to earn, it's something I receive because of God's love and His grace. As I continue growing my faith, it's something that I would like to do is just be more like Christ, showing patience, compassion, humility, and love to people around me. Okay, so although Christian theism best describes my worldview today, I don't think any of us just develop our beliefs, by being isolated. We're all influenced by people, experiences, and the culture around us. Um, One worldview that influenced some of my thinking other than Christian theism was naturalism. So I know James Sire explains that naturalism basically is seeing morality as something people determine for themselves rather than something grounded in God. Looking back, I can see that I adopted some of those cultural messages without even realizing it. I began believing my worth was dependent on achievement, acceptance, like I said, and other people's approval. Instead of asking what God said about me, I looked to culture and my accomplishments to tell me who I was. And those beliefs strongly shaped the way I answered questions about both my identity and right and wrong. I cared so much about what other people thought, and I believed it. So even though I never stopped believing in God, I wasn't fully. It wasn't fully until I started, pursuing Him, that my perspective changed. So instead of allowing culture to define my identity, I then began filtering those messages out through my relationship with God. And today, I still live in the same culture, but my foundation looks different. So instead of asking, what does culture say is true? I try to ask, what does God say is true? And that question continues to shape the way I live and make decisions every day. One of the biggest ways my worldview shows up in the kind of leader I hope to become uh or sorry, the one of the biggest ways my worldview shows up is in the kind of leader I hope to become. So to me, leadership isn't just about being in charge, it's about how you treat people. It's about, how you treat them, especially when they're struggling. And this quote on this slide says, I never want to become the kind of teacher who stops noticing. So I chose it because it describes exactly the kind of teacher I hope to become. I never want to be focused so much on everything else that I don't focus on or I don't notice how a student is struggling or hurting. And one experience that really shaped me happened while I was substitute teaching. A student was acting out, being very disrespectful. It would have been really easy to just assume they were trying to cause problems, but I pulled them aside. Instead of getting angry at them, I asked, what's wrong? Like, why are you acting out like this? Like, you're not a bad student. Why are you behaving in this way? And he just burst out in tears and he's like, I'm sorry. Everyone just always calls me a bad kid, so I just act like one. And that conversation really changed my perspective. It reminded me behavior is often just a reflection of how we're feeling inside, and people can help others through that. And that's why my Christian worldview matters so much in the classroom, because I believe that students both need both truth and compassion. and they need guidance, but they also need to know that they're cared for and understood. So I believe that's how Jesus led people, and it's the kind of teacher I hope to become. That same mindset shapes my relationships outside of the classroom. Even when I disagree with somebody, I would never want them to leave the conversation feeling like they're not respected. And I always want to try to understand their perspective and love them, because they all have different backgrounds than me. So we all have different opinions. And ultimately, I hope people remember me that I, just genuinely cared about them. One of the clearest ways my worldview has shaped my life is through my calling to special education. I do believe people, like, when they ask me, why are you choosing special ed? It's so hard. I'm like, I didn't really choose it. I feel like God just led me to it. Because the first time I subbed in special ed, actually, they wished me luck, and they're like, at the end of the day, they're like, you probably want to bang your head against the wall, huh? It was a hard day. And I'm like, I don't know. I kind of loved it. So I just felt like it was exactly where I was supposed to be. I think my own experiences have given me a deeper compassion for students who feel unseen or misunderstood. And that's why one phrase on the slide says behaviors communication. Instead of asking, how do I stop this behavior? I try to ask, like, where's this coming from? What are they trying to tell me? What's on their heart? And then more than anything, I want my classroom to be a place where students know they're seen, valued, capable. And I hope they don't remember me for my lessons, but just someone that showed up for them and cared and never gave up on them. Um, my worldview naturally shapes the values I try to live by every day. So before talking about my values, though, I want to briefly define ethics. I know our textbook kind of explained that ethics is concerned with the values and morals that guide our decisions. I'm so sorry, excuse me, about what is right and wrong. And I like that definition because leadership is about more than them making good decisions. It's about, you know, developing the character to live those out. And the first ethical value I chose is beneficence, which basically just means doing good and promoting the well being of others. And that is one of the reasons I volunteer. I serve through my church, and I do feel called to special education. The second ethical value is justice, which means treating people fairly while protecting the dignity of those who are vulnerable. Because in my Christian worldview, I believe every person deserves compassion, respect, and the opportunity to succeed. The personal value I chose is faith. So for me, faith just means trusting in God and finding my identity in Christ instead of an achievement or other people's approval, because that didn't work for me before. And these values are important to me because I understand they guide me the way I live every day. My faith shapes how I understand justice and beneficence. And together, they influence the way I teach, I serve, the way I lead, and just relate to other people. Um, One thing I realized while preparing this presentation is our values don't really mean much unless they show up in how you live every day. So it's easy to just be like, oh, compassion, justice, faith, they're important. But it's like, how are you living that way? The first picture I chose as a reminder of justice and compassion, why they matter so much to me. When I see a child who's hurting or struggling, I don't just see difficult behavior. I see someone who deserves to be noticed, understood, and cared for. So I never want one of my students to feel invisible. The second picture represents serving others. So volunteering has become one of the biggest ways I live out my faith. Some of the most meaningful moments of my life haven't come from achievements, they've come from serving and simply being there for other people. And the last picture represents my faith. My relationship with Christ continues to grow every day. I'm not perfect. I still struggle with things like anxiety, comparison, but I've learned to trust God even when I don't understand his plan. When I look at these pictures together, I realize they really tell how my faith shapes the way I see people, the way I serve them, and ultimately the kind of teacher I hope to become and leader. Preparing this presentation gave me the opportunity to really reflect on my life in a way I never had before, and how everything has shaped me in my worldview. One of the biggest things I realized is that much of my life revolved around that one question of what gives a person worth. For many years, I looked for that answer in everything other than what I should have been, which is my worth comes from God. Looking back, I can see God didn't waste any part of my story. Even the difficult seasons taught me things like empathy and compassion and shaped me. More than anything, this presentation reminded me that my worldview isn't just something I believe, it's something I try to live every day. I'm grateful how for God shaped my life, and I'm excited to keep growing in my faith. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. This presentation really helped me, realize how deeply my experiences shape my worldview and values. Looking back, I can see God has used every part of my story to shape who I am today. And as I move forward into my career, I hope to live out those values that I've shared throughout the presentation in the way I teach, I lead, serve others. So thank you for listening. Have a great day.